Welcome to the fifth episode of the Analytics podcast. Today, we're joined by Josh Pohlkamp-Hartt, who is the Associate Director of Hockey Analytics at the Boston Bruins. Josh, how are you doing?
I'm good. Nice Thursday. Team's not playing, so relaxing.
Yeah, it sounds great. Yeah, just wanted to introduce you a bit. So, Josh earned his PhD in statistics from Queen's University, worked at Apple Maps on cutting edge data projects, and then realized his childhood dream of working in the NHL. From designing metrics to measure neutral zone play in junior hockey to now developing in game analytics for one of the most storied franchises in the league, Josh has a wealth of knowledge on how data is reshaping professional hockey. It's great to have you here. Yeah,
Thanks for having me.
yeah, of course. Yeah. So we'd like to just start off, by asking about your current role with the Bruins. Could you give us an overview of your day-to-day, responsibilities as the associate director of hockey analytics for the Bruins, and which aspects of the team operations do you spend the most time supporting?
Yeah, the things I do varies from time of year, sort of seasonality. This time of year, a lot of it is supporting our coaches and our management in how we make decisions on who we play and what kind of strategies we use against certain teams, as well as things like player acquisition, with the trade deadline coming up in a couple of months. So a lot of my work right now is around that. But there is a balance. There is a fair amount of model building also that we have cyclically. So every year you might need to update certain models you use all the time. Expected goals models is kind of a consistent thing that everyone has. So as you get new, better, or more data, you start to try and improve as much as you can in the way you're describing things like shots, as well as we do that for lots of other events as well. But my time is spent mostly bouncing between data science and analysis for some of our staff. So a typical day might involve me doing some coding, but also probably involves me writing some reports, which I have to send to some of our staff, like our coaches.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, it's really interesting. Kind of relate to like some of the work you've done. You mentioned that your work touches everything from scouting prospects for a draft to helping players rehab for injury. Could you walk us through how analytics informs such varied areas of hockey operations?
Yeah, we sort of have a mindset within our group that anywhere there's a decision and anywhere we think we can get data, we're going to apply them. The idea being that we want to give our staff the most information possible. Scouts are a great example. They have all this wealth of information and they write all these great reports and they submit grades. They do all this stuff all year long. And it used to be that it just sort of lives somewhere in an app and no one really touched it. And what we've tried to do is harness a lot of that, not just to give things like predictive analytics, because that's something that certainly teams want, like what's the probability of this player being an NHL player, but also descriptive things to help them when they're talking through their choices between A and B. Is this player a good skater? Well, if 8 out of 10 of you said he's a good skater, we probably would like to know that. Whereas if many of you have the same concerns about this player saying that he doesn't defend at all and I don't think he can ever score any goals, well, maybe that's not a player of any value. So for scouts, that's sort of the mindset there. But we do the same thing with almost every aspect. You can look at things like rehabilitation of players where the data is much more private and secure, but there's lots of information and metrics that can be collected by our sports science staff, and we can help them to organize it and allow them to be actionable with it. And that's sort of what we're trying to do in all those spaces. We're not trying to be sort of prescriptive to anyone. We're mostly just trying to give everyone access to all the information that either they have currently or would love to have had 5 years ago.
Mhm. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Yeah, it's all the different areas that hockey analytics can make a impact. It's really interesting. Wanted to ask, how do you kind of like translate these complex statistical models into insights that coaches, players, and front office staff can quickly grasp and use in decision making? Because I know you kind of referred to how you create reports for the coaches. So how can you kind of translate these data insights into something which these coaches can understand?
Yeah, the first thing, and this is something that was a learning I had done a little bit from Apple when you work with executives, but certainly they're a little more data literate than your average coach would be. And it's a lot about meeting them on their terms and meeting them with language that they can understand. And then a lot of times when you're doing metric design, try and use units that they can understand. Like if you're talking about, let's expected goals again, like that, that's in the construct of goals, right? If I am +1 expected goals, well, it probably means I should have scored one extra goal in
Hmm.
that game compared to the opponent. So using units and using measures that have units that make sense to them. Time is another great one. Those are very useful. And then keeping things in things like percentiles or things that are easy for them, color coding stuff. Like there's lots of ways to communicate what is good versus bad that can go back to the natural understandings of people, right? Everyone has played enough video games or seen enough things nowadays that like they understand what 100 out of 100 is. 50 out of 100 isn't very good, right? Like people can get that sense. So doing things like that are very helpful. And then, we try to not overload them with what a model really is in the back end. Um, that takes trust. You have to really have spent enough time working on things and be able to give them very good canonical examples to say that this metric is describing the randomness that they are hoping or the variance that they're hoping for.
Hmm.
Defensive metrics are the worst, right? Because it's very hard for us in hockey to understand who is a good player by what happens, because what doesn't happen is probably more important to
Yeah.
a defensive player. So when you come up with metrics and things, there's lots of these different sort of like RAPM metrics, on ice, plus minus metrics, stuff like that, where you are saying, well, nothing happened when this player was on that was bad, so he gets a plus in this way. And a scout's not going to understand that you've used some kind of complex regression model for this. So you kind of have to say, well, the top 10 players are these 10 players. Can you understand that this means that they probably are good? The bottom 10 players are these 10 players. It probably means that they are bad. And if you look at them, the scouts generally can pick out which are the good versus the bad group. So, that's a lot of the ways that we try and get this across. But certainly it takes a lot of time. We don't give them a new metric and then expect them to be relying on it day one. Certainly it takes us more than the season usually to get something to being really a staple.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Kind of want to transition a little bit into some of the research that you did in your PhD. Your doctoral research spans signal detection, cardiology, and hockey player performance. How did this combination of academic rigor and sports passion set you up for your NHL career?
I think the academic part, what's really useful is getting reps of taking projects from start to finish and working with data that either you don't know very well, or you're sort of having to figure out the problems with and then turn that into a product. And that's sort of, I think, bachelor's theses and master's programs can offer a lot of that same thing that I had in my PhD, but that's definitely a big value. You also learn about how to write in sort of a more communicative, effective way. I had an advisor who would go back through everything I said and pinpoint these 5 words throughout, like, 4 pages where it didn't make any, to him, it didn't make sense. So understanding the use of a word when you call something significant, is it statistically significant or is it just significant to you? Because if it's just significant to you, probably call it important, right? Like using language that's correct is very helpful. I think the other side of that is that academics and students in general are probably much more verbose, use a lot more words than necessary. And that was probably the biggest learning I had at Apple from a communication standpoint is you just got to cut it all down, right? Give everyone the simplest executive summary you can. If they would like to read the details, let them have them later, but you do not need to be providing someone with the step-by-step details before you give them the answer to their question.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think it's interesting to see how some of the work you did in that field kind of translate to what you're doing now. While finishing your PhD, you established an analytics program with the Kingston Frontenacs. How did that collaboration come about, and what were some of your first big breakthroughs in major junior hockey data?
Yeah, I was interested in this because I had seen a lot of reports online of people starting to work with data, and I had, the vigor and interest of a PhD student. So I reached out to the Frontenacs and said, "Would you be interested in letting me look at this?" And I had kind of put together a little idea of what I thought a neutral zone metric might be, and so I had pulled that together, and I said, "Hey, can I grab some data? Can I go to games and collect whether or not we're succeeding in the neutral zone. And they said, so long as you give us things like Corsi, I don't care what you do with the neutral zone. If it helps us, it helps us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got a whole bunch of students, and I paid them in pizza, and we went to games, and we would track a bunch of data, and that helped the Frontenacs with knowing things like Corsi, so they're understanding who was really dominating the shot share for our team. But then the neutral zone play was interesting too, because you got to see some stylistic differences. There's a team in Sault Ste. Marie who they refuse to give up the puck. They will just regroup over and over and over again. And the same style of play actually works for Tampa Bay currently in the NHL. It's the same sort of thing they would do. And so my metric would immediately fail, because the idea was you skate into the neutral zone and you have to try and get to the offensive zone. So once you enter the neutral zone, success is the offensive zone, failure is everything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, that doesn't work if your team's just going to turn back around and go again and again and again.
Mm-hmm.
So learning those sort of things and how your metric design has to be simple, but also speaking with the coaches and them being like, they're low, right? Because they keep going back and forth. And you're like, yes. So maybe that's not the best metric. Maybe the best metric is something like ozone possession time, right? Because that's going to be a proxy for how you play in the neutral zone, but it's going to tell you probably more about the thing you care about, which is how much time did I spend in the other team's end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, it was fun. And that coach ended up working in the NHL soon after. So
that's great.
It was good to have experience working with them and learning kind of what coaches think and how they operate. Yeah.
Yeah, that seems like really valuable experience. Before joining the Bruins, you kind of mentioned how you spent some time at Apple. So you spent 3 years at Apple. How did working on large scale mapping and autonomous systems shape your perspective on data science, especially compared to smaller scale sports analytics environments?
I think the big thing and when I came from Apple, I had this mindset of being like, oh, we could try and do things that are from there, but it's very different. With a large company, you can throw a lot of resources at things. So mapping projects, and this is sort of a dirty secret of all of the mapping projects, is that they have tons and tons of people who manually adjust things all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't do that when you are a sports team. You can't hire 500 people to go and manually adjust all the data for all the leagues. So that is sort of one of the biggest things that was different. And when you're working on those large scale projects, things will move more slowly, and you have to be willing and able to collaborate. Within a smaller team, we certainly have a lot of collaboration, but it is only, our total team is 5, and I was, managing groups of around 20 on projects. So it's a very different scale. And that part, the communication is still important, but tracking down bits of projects is definitely very different in a large scale company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm sure a lot of people love to have both types of experiences under their belt. How does problem solving in a PhD program or pure research differ from solving questions for an NHL club, and what's the biggest mindset shift that you had to make as a result?
I think there is some desire or willingness to be a little cute with your analysis when you're in research. You're going to do something novel because you would like to have it be maybe the most correct, or use the models that are maybe the most cutting edge. And certainly that's going to give you maybe very, very small marginal gains, but increases complexity and time. When you're in a PhD program, time is not nearly as important as it is in this. So certainly learning to work faster and working for what is best for today, what is good enough. I think that's definitely what has become more important. And I learned a lot of that at Apple, and that's definitely where research applicability kind of can have a double-edged sword. You would like to be able to be good enough, but I don't think, novelty for going to a conference is a necessity. Whereas, that's definitely more what you're trying to do in a research field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. In your published work, you kind of introduced the concepts for evaluating neutral zone play. I think you kind of described this before, but why do you think the neutral zone is so critical in hockey? And if you could just maybe elaborate a little bit more on what kind of metrics that you develop as a result.
Yeah, I mean, the neutral zone is one of those areas that it's very hard to accurately describe everything that goes on, because it is the systems that exist there are fairly well set by each team, and there is different ones for each team, but the actual actions can be highly varied. It's kind of the most random space on the ice in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so defining metrics that get you from point A to point B, as I was saying, can be a little bit of fool's gold, because you could be really, really good, but it's because you always skate to the red line and dump the puck in. But that might actually be a good thing. And so you have to be willing and understanding of what metrics you're trying to define and figuring out how you get through the neutral zone. The Bruins for years have, while I've been here, have not been one of the better neutral zone turnover teams. We give the puck back to the other team at a higher rate most of the time I've been here. And that isn't all that problematic. Up until this season, we were a very strong team that has been able to generate a lot of ozone possession time. And so you're trying to think, is this metric really measuring what I need? And so having, what its predictive value is to your performance is certainly important. And finding the right parts of neutral zone play was actually a big study we worked on more this offseason to try and help with that. I can't give all the learnings because I don't want all the other teams to be able to tell our secret sauce, but certainly, there are ways that you can get through the neutral zone more effectively, and there's ways that it can help you be better set in the future. There are definitely teams that have keyed on a lot of this now. If you look at Florida and Carolina, are two teams that don't really bother with holding on to the puck. They just want the puck away from them, their end. They just keep throwing it away.
Yeah.
And that's definitely a strategy that can work.
Yeah.
So the neutral zone is an interesting thing because you have many different choices.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Kind of relate to, you kind of described how you had, a lot of projects where, it was a quick turnaround, you had to make immediate tactical decisions, but I'm sure you've also worked with some longer term evaluations like the trades or contract negotiations. How do you strike a balance between building quick turnaround analytics and more complex future oriented models?
Yeah, that's the biggest struggle that we always have. And it exists in literally every job I've ever had. At Apple, we would have, stakeholders that want something back immediately, but at the same time, you're trying to improve all of the baseline things. And what I learned there, I was working on a project and I basically automated my own job away and then said, move me to another project. And I've taken that same sort of ethos and brought it here, which is anytime we can make something that's more long-term sustainable and make it something that can be self-serve to our customers, so our staff, we're going to do it, right? We're going to make it so the scouts can go find all those scouting grades themselves rather than relying on us to tell them every time. And it is a hard balance because certainly when you get these requests, usually they're actionable and you want to jump on them, the quick ones. It is a lot about communication, determining whether you have to be able to suss out whether or not it's a useful thing, or if you're really going on a wild goose case and you're just off in the middle of nowhere and it's not going to be helpful, or if it's something that's actually useful. And that figuring that out and being how to be polite enough to be telling them that you're not going to do it is one of the hardest parts, but certainly is a never-ending balance that no one, I think, has solved perfectly. Communication is definitely the biggest way to get there.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Kind of relate to maybe some of the tools you use, which programming languages and databases and machine learning platforms do you use the most with the Bruins? And has your tool set changed significantly over the time you were with the Bruins?
Yeah, so from a data science perspective, we use R and Python for most of our analysis. Our engineers are mostly Python users, so they would prefer everything I do be in Python because it's a lot easier for us to pickle a model and give it to them, or Dockerize things easy. If you're Dockerizing, you can use R or Python, but from an engineering perspective, using the same language is a lot easier, and engineers find Python to be something that they're much more familiar with from school. So that's certainly the language of preference for them. As a statistician, as my background, R is where I spent most of my time, but I've certainly had to grow into more Python because of the role. We have a large amount of sort of AWS infrastructure. I think that's more or less what groups of our size are going to do. Around the league, I'm pretty sure everyone is using AWS as a baseline. Some might have other database backends and use other companies for services for cloud infrastructure, but I would say AWS is probably 95% of the teams.
Mhm.
Um, and we've changed a lot of the way that we build our front end, our web development based on sort of learnings as we've gone. I think we've gone through probably 3 different iterations of what our web app looks like because of changes in availability of platforms and the types of things you can do with like React. That's what we're trying to do, is just make things as easy as we can. And when we got new staff a couple of years ago, they had slightly different knowledge bases, and that was helpful because you kind of want to stay near the front but not right at the bleeding edge. And that's been kind of where we've lived. So engineers definitely want to be able to do things like Java, the web development side, and Python. Those are probably the 2 biggest things that they're using. And then it's Python and R for us on the back end.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Obviously in hockey, I think it's one of the sports where there's a lot of innovation, that is still available. There's a lot of data that's still out there which hasn't been accessed much. But with player and puck tracking becoming more widespread, how do you manage these massive volumes of real time data, and what new possibilities does that open for hockey analytics?
Well, managing the data is definitely a learning project. You have, again, this is one of those things where you need to find the right tool. There are a lot of different companies that will offer, ways to have sort of semi-accessible or semi-indexed data, and so things like ideas like data lakes, and that's sort of where you're starting to move to this sort of idea when you have large-scale data, and then you have to start looking at distributed systems for processing your data, so things like Spark. And learning all of that is definitely complexities that make the job more difficult because you can use less features generally when you go to things that are more distributed, larger scale.
Mhm.
It also relies on a lot of learning how to use GPUs, cloud computing, things like that aren't necessarily in the toolbox of an introductory data scientist. They're going to be, I have a notebook on my computer, and certainly a lot of that still happens when we're trying to do metric design from things like tracking data.
Mhm.
And then on the metrics element, there's so many different new things you can do when you start understanding where everyone is all the time. And I think one of the best ideas is probably around space and space ownership. Soccer, certainly, that's the first place they really went. And I
Mhm.
think that's more or less where hockey tracks soccer in a lot of ways. And so I think that's probably the first place almost every team tried to go after learning about how fast their players are and how hard they shoot,
Mhm.
was probably how much space is owned. And so understanding what metrics are important there, using learnings from soccer, but our physics are very different because you can bounce pucks off the wall and everyone moves very fast.
Mhm.
So those are sort of things that are open. And then from space, you get to defensive attribution. If I know that I control the front of the net, that's the space that I own as a defenseman, and the puck never goes there while I'm on the ice, right? Before we were talking about an absence of data is a good thing. Well, this is an absence of data, but now I can actually collect some data notifying that I was in an important place, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
So our former captain, Chara, who's a massive individual, I would expect that if we had these metrics for him, they would have been very good because people didn't really like to go anywhere near the front of the net when he was on.
Yeah.
His stick is a small tree, and he is a huge, huge man who likes to go to the gym. So I don't think anyone was having very much fun if they were anywhere near him, and he definitely kept the puck out of the net a lot.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's really interesting to see, how analytics can develop over time. You touched upon, the trust aspect that the coaches have with you as a hockey analytics professional. So, some coaches and players might be skeptical or overwhelmed by analytics. How do you build trust and show them that data can be a competitive advantage rather than an added burden?
A lot of it is trying to make their job easier, right?
Mhm.
When we say uh, we have this metric or we have this event and maybe it's turnovers. And if you were going back and watching an entire game over again as a coach, or you were going to watch a new team and you wanted to pull up all the turnovers on a team, we might be able to do that for you. I might be able to give you some metrics saying, well, this player on our, this opponent that we have, this defenseman, he turns the puck over a lot.
Mhm.
And so that's a very useful stat for you to know. So having things that they can trust are relatively truthful. There's lots of randomness in data, so it's not always going to be 100% correct, but you would like to have the accuracy be quite high.
Hmm.
Having that builds trust, as well as speaking to them in like terms, and then making their life easier is certainly the best way, right? If you are just being helpful, they're going to be on board.
Hmm.
Um, we have had, we're now on our third coach with my time here, and they have all been open and willing to use the data and discuss data. Certainly there's a skepticism, and there's difficulty with accuracy always, and that's sort of the thing that gets them is if you have one data point wrong in a game and they're looking at a game sample and there was only 10 events of that type, they're
Yeah.
going to be quite, they're going to be like, well, you have this as an odd man rush and it wasn't.
Hmm.
Okay, well, I can't do anything about that because at this one particular instance where we trigger our events, it's probably an odd man rush. But I understand your point that 3 seconds later, this was a play that wasn't particularly dangerous.
Hmm.
That's okay. Um, but I think that's sort of the thing is you have to build the trust and have them understand that we're just happy, friendly people who are trying to be a member of the team, and that is a part of the Bruins ethos too. That team comes first. So certainly there is never an us versus them in any group discussions we have. It's always how does our use of data help with our making of decisions and their insights from their experiences.
Yeah, yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And I was actually going to answer, one of my following questions, kind of relate to how, long before analytics, mostly a lot of the player evaluation was concentrated around traditional scouting methods. And it's nice to see, that they're kind of used in tandem rather than, as competing um, processes. But yeah, kind of relate to our mission here at Sport Analytics. Obviously we're trying to make courses, which can help professionals, develop skills in the industry and help get them jobs in the future. For someone dreaming of working for an NHL team in analytics, which technical skills like coding, advanced stats, or domain expertise are most critical to master?
I think it's coding to completion is sort of where I put it. Like being able to go from ideation and say, I think this is something I'd like to look into, and then being able to find the data or have the data, which certainly is a lot easier when you're a professional than it is if you're an amateur or someone just trying this out. Building some kind of model or metric. So using the right techniques, understanding things like what is the accuracy and precision relative to some baseline, and looking at other measures related to metric design. Those things are important, or modeling, like understanding how do you actually evaluate models, and then taking that from just sort of the statistical space into the actionable insight space. So now you have something you say, okay, well, what can I do with this? And getting it into a report and having some kind of insights that are applicable. I think that's sort of that to me, getting reps at that cycle is the biggest, most important thing. And a lot of teams are looking for that sort of experience. It's projects on your own. It could be projects through school. You could see why a lot of the big data bowl people are hired by teams because that's generally like, oh, you've done a project that's
Mhm.
exactly in the vein of what we're going to want to do internally. And maybe the stuff you do internally is not nearly as complicated, but that's the mindset, and that's sort of the thing I would say is the most important is taking it from tip to tail. Uh, so all those half completed projects that people have, that's sort of that second half is sort of the thing that they probably need to work on.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Given your background, obviously you've had a lot of experience, going up to a PhD at Queens, where do you see gaps in like standard sports analytics curriculum or anything related to data science? Are there like any topics or methodologies you wish more students came in already knowing?
I'm actually really impressed with what students know nowadays for the most part.
Mhm.
A lot of the good programs in terms of sports analytics are providing them with a good baseline in terms of models and metrics, and I think that that's fairly effective. I think the biggest thing that people need is still just reps. Like when I work with people who are students, a lot of times, they still need a lot of handholding or helping through processes. And that's the part that I want to see more is I want you to feel empowered and feel like you can push something out completely. So that final third is probably like the report writing part is probably the part that I think is least defined. So it's the
Mhm.
communications aspect, which is sort of funny because as a person who was in school, for math and stats, we spent less time on that and a lot more time on models and metrics. And I had a lot of friends who were in business classes who had presentations every week or 2 weeks. And now I'm saying, well, you need more of that in mine.
Yeah.
And back then I would have thought that what they were doing was less valuable because it wasn't so sort of hard science.
Mhm.
But I think that's the part that students have to make sure they're still aware of is communication efficiency.
Yeah, that's something we would love to emphasize in our courses. Thanks a lot for advice, and thanks a lot, Josh, for being on this podcast. Your insights and your advice were really valuable to us and to our viewers. If you want to see more industry professionals talking about the field of sports analytics, stay tuned. We'll have a lot of episodes coming out soon. Thanks a lot, Josh.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.